I never saw it coming. I mean, how could I? There I was, sitting at the dinner table, savoring the peace after a long day, when my 42-year-old wife, Sarah, looked me straight in the eyes and said she was having dinner with a colleague. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Dinner with a co-worker sounds pretty harmless, right? But let's not pretend it was something innocent. This wasn't just some casual meal, it was a full-on, no-holds-barred date with some guy from her office. And she dropped that bomb like it was no big deal. Let me take a step back. Sarah and I got married when she was 22, young and naive and expecting a child. We barely knew what we were getting into, but like many young couples, we took the plunge. It's funny when I think about it now, today's 20-somethings seem to have it so much more together than we ever did. But back then, it felt like the right choice, and for a while it was. We had some great years, especially early on. After we tied the knot, I started investing. Numbers had always been my thing, so I built a business around it, growing it into something successful. We ended up more than comfortable. I provided Sarah and our family with a life many would envy. But no amount of money could prevent what came next. Our son was born, and he was the light of our lives, but he was also very sick. Watching him suffer, knowing that no amount of wealth, no doctors or treatments could save him, that kind of helplessness stays with you. It haunts you. He fought his illness for years before passing away, and Sarah changed. She pulled away. I get it, grief does that to people, but she didn't just withdraw. She completely shut me out. We were still married, but emotionally and physically, we were more like strangers living under the same roof. I tried everything: therapy, vacations, time off work, anything to bring her back. Nothing worked. For years, she was like a ghost, unreachable in our home. It took a long time for therapists to get her to open up even a little. Things improved, but not by much. She was different, and I wasn't sure she would ever be the same again. Now, fast forward to that night at the dinner table. She drops this bombshell she's going out with her colleague. She acted like it was no big deal. He's just a friend, she said. Someone supportive, someone I can talk to. Yeah, right, I wasn't born yesterday. This wasn't about conversation. She said her morale was better, her energy was higher, thanks to him. At that moment, I didn't know what to say. My mind went blank. How do you respond when your wife casually tells you she's going on a date with another man? I didn't want to yell or fight, so I just got up and walked out of the kitchen. I didn't grab my keys or my phone, nothing. I just walked, and she ran after me. I'll never forget the desperation in her voice. She knew she'd gone too far. Wait, she called out, her footsteps rushing behind me. It's not what you think, please listen. But I didn't want to hear it. What could she possibly say to justify this? That it wasn't a betrayal? That somehow this was okay. She begged me to believe her, swearing it wasn't cheating, insisting he was just a colleague and that I was making it bigger than it really was. Then came the kicker: he makes me feel alive again, she said. I couldn't believe it. Alive again? From what? A dinner? A man who isn't me? I was too furious to reply, but I knew one thing: if I told her not to go, she'd still go. That's just who Sarah is. She always gets what she wants, no matter the cost. The problem is, she never considers how high the price might be. I needed to figure out what to do next. I wasn't going to just let this slide. I'd put up with a lot over the years, but this was a line I couldn't ignore. I needed proof, solid evidence of what she was up to. So I called a friend of mine, someone with connections, the kind of people who could dig into someone's life and find out everything. I explained the situation, and he set me up with a private investigator. I wanted all the details: who this guy was, how he lived, what his intentions were. I needed to know where they went, what they talked about, what they did. And yeah, I wanted pictures, proof of them together. Deep down, I knew this was more than just dinner. My gut told me something was off, and I wasn't about to let my life unravel without knowing exactly what was happening behind my back. That's how I left it. The pie was on the job, and I was waiting to find out who this guy was and what Sarah was really up to. I know what you're thinking: why didn't I just confront her right then and there? Well, I've learned that sometimes you've got to be patient and let the truth come to you. When it does, that's when you strike back hard. But for now, I waited. And that, my friends, is where it all began. The detective didn't waste any time. A few days after I gave him the go-ahead, he came back with the first piece of information about this guy. His name was Bob. Yeah, Bob. It's always someone with a plain, ordinary name, isn't it? But don't be fooled, Bob wasn't just some random guy. He had a family, 2 kids, a wife, a decent job. He lived in a nice house, one of those suburban McMansions with a white picket fence and probably a dog in the yard. A picture-perfect life. But you know what they say, appearances can be deceiving, and I was going to find out exactly what was behind that facade. The detective didn't just give me the basics, he dug deep. I got everything: Bob's home address, where his kids went to school, what his wife did for a living, even the car he drove. It was all laid out for me, like a file on the man who was supposedly so supportive of my wife that she felt the need to dress up and go out with him. I stared at his picture for a long time. He looked harmless enough, just another middle-aged guy who probably spent his weekends watching sports. But looks can be deceiving, and I wasn't about to take any chances. I knew Sarah wasn't telling me the full story, and I wasn't going to wait around for her to come clean. So, I started planning. When you have the kind of money I do, you can make things happen, big things, and I didn't care what it cost. This was about pride, about getting the truth, and about revenge. My next move? Well, that would require a particular kind of person, and I knew exactly who to talk to. I reached out to an old friend. This guy, let's call him Mike, had the right connections in all the necessary places, if you catch my drift. He owed me a few favors from back in the day, so when I explained the situation to him, he didn't hesitate. Mike made a call almost instantly. The person he contacted? Well, let's just say she was exactly the type I needed. She was young, minus 27, maybe 28 at most, blonde, with legs that seemed to go on forever, and a face that could make any guy do a double take. The kind of woman that would make someone like Bob forget all about his picture-perfect family in the suburbs. When Mike showed me her photo, I didn't need to think twice. I gave the green light immediately. She was perfect. Now, I know what you're thinking. You probably have a pretty good idea about what this girl does for a living, but I'm not going to spell it out here. I know how Reddit works, and I'm not looking to get this post flagged for inappropriate content. Let's just say she was very good at her job, and leave it at that. With her on board, the plan was really starting to take shape, but I wasn't going to stop at just setting Bob up. No, I wanted to make sure I had all the bases covered. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. I needed to know what Bob was doing when he wasn't with her, how he spent his time, who else he might be seeing. I needed a complete picture, not just a snapshot of a single date. The private investigator was still digging up dirt, and I had the girl ready to make her move. I was confident that everything would unfold exactly the way I wanted. Guys like Bob always slip up eventually, and when he did, I'd be right there, ready to catch him in the act with all the proof I needed. But then, out of nowhere, everything almost blew up in my face. It was the day before the planned date with Bob when Sarah dropped a bombshell on me. We were sitting in the kitchen, and I was playing it cool, acting like I wasn't orchestrating her entire downfall behind the scenes. She looked up from her phone and casually said, "I've been thinking. I'm not going to meet Bob tomorrow after all." For a second, I couldn't even process what she had just said. She wasn't going. After all the effort I had put into this, after I'd set everything up to catch her and Bob red-handed, what was going on? I forced myself to stay calm. "Oh," I asked, trying to sound indifferent. "Why not?" She hesitated, then said, "I just changed my mind. I don't think it's appropriate. Instead, I'm meeting a friend. We're going to have dinner at that new restaurant downtown." I stared at her, my mind racing. Something about this didn't sit right with me. Maybe she had reconsidered her decision about Bob. Maybe she realized how wrong it would be to go through with it, but something in the way she said it felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on here than she was letting on, and when she mentioned meeting a friend, I had to wonder if this friend was someone else entirely. Was it still Bob, or was there another man in the picture? I knew better than to press her on it. If I seemed too interested, she'd get suspicious. So I nodded, acting like I was fine with it, but deep down I wasn't about to let her off the hook that easily. No, the plan was still in motion. I wasn't going to call off the private investigator or the girl just because Sarah suddenly had a change of heart. Whatever she was up to, whether it involved Bob or someone else, I was going to find out. She could try to change the story all she wanted, but by this point I had too much invested in the outcome, so I sat back, pretending everything was fine, while behind the scenes I kept everything moving forward. Believe me, one way or another, I was going to catch her. As it turns out, my gut feeling was right all along. Sarah was still planning to go on that date with Bob. It didn't matter what she had told me in the kitchen, her actions spoke louder than her words. The private investigator confirmed it for me when he sent over the latest update, She had reserved a table for two at a fancy restaurant, the kind of place we used to go when things were good between us. But that wasn't even the worst part. She had also booked a hotel room. Not just any room, either a $400 a night suite. The kind of room you don't rent just to talk. I knew exactly what was going on. It didn't take a genius to figure it out. Dinner, drinks, and then a night in that expensive hotel room with Bob. Just thinking about it made my blood boil, but I knew I had to stay calm. This wasn't the time to lose my head. I had to act, and I had to be smart about it. The first thing I did was assign one of the two detectives to watch Bob's house. I needed to know if Bob's wife was going to be home while my wife was off with him. It was all part of the plan, and timing was everything. The goal wasn't just to catch Sarah and Bob together. I wanted to destroy Bob's life too, so we waited. That's the worst part of situations like this, the waiting, knowing what's about to happen but having to sit tight until the right moment to strike. Then the first piece of evidence came in a photo. It showed Sarah and Bob sitting at the restaurant, looking cozy, like she didn't have a husband waiting at home. But that wasn't what set me off. No, what really made me see red was the second photo. It captured them kissing, right there in the middle of the restaurant, like they didn't have a care in the world, like what they were doing was completely normal. I wanted to lose it. I wanted to punch something, break something, anything, but I knew I had to stay level-headed. This was just the beginning. I knew they wouldn't stop at the restaurant. The hotel room was waiting, and there was no doubt in my mind that's where they were headed next. But before they could get there, I had one more move to make. I called the detective stationed outside Bob's house. "Is she home?" I asked, referring to Bob's wife. "Yes, she's home," he confirmed. Perfect. That was all I needed. I sent the detective the photo of Bob and Sarah kissing, along with very specific instructions. I'll never forget the feeling of satisfaction that washed over me as I imagined how everything was going to unfold. The detective knocked on the door, and when Bob's wife answered, she probably expected it to be something ordinary. What she got, though, was far from routine. The detective didn't waste any time. He asked if she knew where her husband was. Naturally, she didn't. Bob had told her he'd be working late, just like he probably always did when he was sneaking around behind her back. When the detective asked her again, she got nervous. I could practically picture her panic, likely imagining something awful had happened to him. But the detective quickly reassured her, saying, "He's fine, but I think you should take a look at this." He handed her the photo, the one of Bob kissing Sarah. I could only imagine the shock on her face, her world probably beginning to collapse right there on the doorstep. She stammered something about Bob working late, that he said he'd be home later, but the detective cut her off, calmly letting her know that her husband wasn't working late, he was out on a date. I knew exactly what would happen next. As soon as the detective left, Bob's wife would be calling him, yelling into the phone, demanding answers. And when Bob saw her name pop up, I bet his heart skipped a beat. He'd probably come up with some excuse, trying to calm her down, but she wouldn't buy it. No, she'd be in full meltdown mode, and just as I anticipated, Bob would rush home, desperate to salvage what was left of his wrecked life. While that chaos was unfolding on Bob's end, I was at home, waiting for Sarah to return. I held the picture in my hand, the one of her kissing Bob, and I'll tell you, that was the last time I ever felt anything for her. That image was seared into my memory, and whatever love or respect I once had for her was completely gone. But that wasn't the end, not even close. I had much more planned. This wasn't just about catching her in the act or humiliating Bob. I intended to dismantle everything. As I sat there waiting for Sarah, I was already finalizing the next phase of my plan. Sarah thought she was smart, believed she could pull this off without facing any consequences. What she didn't realize was who she was dealing with. I had spent years building my business, making connections, learning how to control situations and turn them to my advantage. This was just another problem for me to solve, another deal to close. And when I was done, Sarah and Bob would regret every choice that led them to that dinner. The moment of revenge was finally within reach. I had been playing the long game, watching everything play out, and now it was time to strike. Remember that blonde woman I mentioned? The one with the flawless blonde hair, long legs, and a body that could make any man lose his mind. If you didn't catch on before, let me make it clear she wasn't just some random woman. She was the key to setting the final part of my plan in motion. You've probably guessed her profession by now, but I'll keep it vague for obvious reasons. When Sarah left for her date, the blonde was already at my place, waiting. In person, she looked even better, dressed in a sleek, tight dress that left little to the imagination. We sat down, had a few glasses of wine. Honestly, I needed the wine more than she did. I wasn't nervous exactly, but the anticipation of what I was about to do weighed heavily on me. It's not every day you plan to cheat on your wife, even if it's for revenge. But then again, could it really be called cheating when she had already destroyed our marriage with Bob? It didn't feel like a betrayal on my end, it felt like payback. After a few more glasses, we headed upstairs. Let me be clear, there was nothing romantic about what happened next. There was no passion, no love, not even lust, really. It was just a transaction, something that needed to be done to close the chapter Sarah had started. The blonde was good at her job, but my mind was elsewhere the entire time. I wasn't thinking about her, or even about Sarah at that moment. It was mechanical, like I was just going through the motions. We began having sex, but it was more like checking a box than anything else. There was no emotion, no satisfaction. I wasn't there for pleasure, this was business. As I lay there, detached from the act, all I could think about was how Sarah would react when she walked through that door. The shock on her face when she saw me in bed with another woman, that's what I was waiting for. That was the only part of this that mattered. And sure enough, right on time, the front door opened. I heard it creak, followed by her footsteps echoing down the hall. We didn't stop. I didn't pause, didn't hesitate. I wanted her to walk in and see it all. When Sarah finally stepped into the room and saw us, her scream was immediate. She shrieked like she had just walked into the middle of a crime scene, and maybe she had. She froze in the doorway, her eyes wide, her face pale, completely stunned by what she was seeing. The blonde didn't hang around. She dressed so quickly, it was like she had rehearsed for this exact moment her whole life. She didn't say a word, didn't even glance back as she slipped out of the room and out the front door, leaving Sarah and me alone to deal with the aftermath. Then Sarah erupted. I'd seen her angry before, but this was different. It was like she had completely lost control of herself. She screamed at me, accusing me of betraying her, of being the one who had ruined our marriage. I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter, humorless laugh. Here she was yelling at me, as if she hadn't just been out with Bob booking hotel rooms and playing the part of the perfect mistress. I let her scream for a while, just watching her unravel. She paced back and forth, throwing her hands up, cursing me, calling me every name in the book, and I just stood there, waiting for her to run out of steam. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I calmly pulled out my phone and showed her the picture, the one of her and Bob kissing in the restaurant. The photo she thought would never see the light of day. I know about the hotel, I said, my tone icy as I held the phone up for her to see. The one you booked for tonight, where you planned to spend the night with Bob. Her face changed in an instant. The fury and self-righteousness disappeared, replaced by shock and maybe a hint of fear. She mumbled something, trying to come up with an explanation, but I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. You're staying there tonight, I said coldly. That room won't go to waste. For a moment, she didn't respond. I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how to twist the situation, how to play the victim, but she had nothing. She was cornered, and she knew it. She made one last attempt to turn the tables, her voice shaking as she yelled, "How could you do this? After everything we've been through, now you're the one cheating. How can you live with yourself?" I shook my head, incredulous. "You really think I'm to blame here?" I asked. "You went out with another man. You rented a hotel room, intending to sleep with him. Don't stand there pretending you're innocent." She kept trying to argue, to paint what I had done as worse than what she had been doing, who knows for how long. But I wasn't playing her game anymore. I stood firm, my voice steady, and told her the truth, that this was her fault. Everything from her emotional detachment to her affair with Bob had led us to this moment. Eventually, she gave up. She grabbed her purse, fumbled for her phone, and called a taxi. I didn't stop her. I just watched as she packed her things, knowing full well that she was heading to that hotel room she had booked for Bob. Only now she'd be spending the night alone. When the door finally slammed shut behind her, I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no relief. Just a cold emptiness where our life together had once been. Sure, the revenge had its own bitter satisfaction, but it didn't fill the void she had left in our marriage. It didn't fix anything. All it did was bring everything to its inevitable end. But the story wasn't over yet. The next phase of my plan was already underway, and when it was complete, Sarah wouldn't just be humiliated, she'd be destroyed. Filing for divorce was the final step, the final nail in the coffin. After everything, the lies, the cheating, the betrayal, it was the only logical move. I had no interest in trying to save anything. I didn't care about her excuses, her tears, or her attempts to rewrite history. To me, our marriage had ended the moment she stepped out with Bob. Everything after that was just a formality. I didn't waste any time. I hired the best lawyers money could buy, no half measures, no cutting corners. These were sharks, the kind of lawyers who didn't just win cases, they decimated the other side. I knew I was in good hands. We sat down, went over everything, and I made it clear what I wanted. I wanted her out of my life for good, and I wanted to make sure she walked away with as little as possible. This wasn't about fairness, it was about making sure she paid for everything she had done. And trust me, I had the resources to make that happen. The first thing I did was block her on my phone. I didn't want to hear from her, didn't want to read her texts, didn't want to listen to her voicemails. Every line of communication was blocked. If she needed to reach me, she'd have to do it through the lawyers. There was nothing left to say. The moment she left for that hotel, any last bit of care or concern I had for her disappeared. We were done. As expected, the divorce process took a lot of time. These things never go quickly, especially when there's money involved. And we had plenty to fight over: the house, the assets, the business, everything was on the table. Sarah tried to play hardball at first. She thought she was entitled to half of everything, thought she could walk away with a clean slate and a fat bank account, but she had underestimated me. She didn't realize what I was willing to do to ensure she got only what she deserved. There were court dates, lawyer meetings, depositions, the whole messy process, and through it all, we never spoke. Not once. Every time we were in the courtroom together, we didn't say a word, didn't even glance at each other. I'd catch glimpses of her, trying to look composed, but I could tell she was unraveling under the pressure. This wasn't the Sarah I had married. This was a woman clinging desperately to whatever she could, but she was slipping and she knew it. My lawyers were relentless. In every negotiation, every hearing, they tore her apart. They found every loophole, every clause in our prenup, every bit of financial evidence that worked in my favor. And of course the photos of her with Bob were the final blow. The proof of her infidelity was undeniable. She couldn't argue it, couldn't twist it to her advantage. She was caught, and the courts saw it for what it was: her affair, her fault, her destruction of our marriage. The process dragged on for months, and at times it felt like it would never end. But I was patient. I wasn't in any rush. Every day that passed, I knew we were getting closer to the finish line, and I knew I was winning. I could see it in her face, in the way she carried herself, defeated, humiliated. She had gone from fighting tooth and nail to barely showing up for the hearings. Deep down, I think she knew there was no way out for her, not this time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the day came when it was all over. The judge handed down the final ruling, and it was exactly what I had hoped for. I walked away with nearly everything: the house, the business, the majority of our assets. Sarah was left with scraps, a meager settlement that wouldn't last her more than a few months. She tried to argue for more, claimed she needed support, but the evidence was stacked against her. The court sided with me on every major issue. It was over. I'll never forget the look on her face when the final ruling was read. It was a mix of disbelief, anger, and something else, maybe regret. But I didn't care. All I knew was that I had won. I had taken everything from her, just as she had tried to take everything from me, and in the end she was left with almost nothing. As we left the courtroom on that final day, I didn't say a word to her. There was nothing left to discuss. We were done, completely and finally done. I didn't look back as I walked out the door, and I haven't looked back since. But the truth is, even with everything behind me, there's no real sense of satisfaction. Sure, I took almost everything from her, and yes, she's no longer part of my life. But there's no victory in this, no feeling of triumph. What remains is just the empty aftermath of a marriage that should have ended long before it did. I won the battle, but the war was brutal, and no one walks away from that without scars. It's strange, to be on the other side of all that chaos, to look back at the lies, the betrayal, the divorce, and realize it's all over. For the longest time it felt like I'd never reached this point, like the mess Sarah had created would follow me forever. But here I am, standing, living, moving forward. The first few months after the divorce were tough, not going to lie. I thought that once everything was settled, I'd feel some sense of relief. I believed that winning, taking everything from her, would make me feel whole again. But the truth is, nothing really prepares you for what comes after. You can't just erase years of history, the emotional damage, and the weight of it all. There's no magic moment where everything returns to normal. You have to rebuild, and rebuilding takes time. I had to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage, beyond the anger and the desire for revenge. For so long, everything had revolved around her, about exposing her, catching her, and getting even. Once that chapter closed, I had to figure out what remained of me. I immersed myself in work, expanded my business, and threw all my energy into it. It paid off. The company is thriving more than ever, and financially I'm in a great place. Money doesn't solve all your problems, but I'll admit, it makes things a lot easier when you're trying to piece your life back together. Therapy helped too, although I was hesitant at first. I didn't want to sit in front of some stranger and pour out my feelings, but it worked. I learned how to let go of some of the anger and bitterness. You carry that stuff around too long, and it'll destroy you from the inside. The process was slow though. It wasn't like a sudden transformation. It was more like chipping away at a wall, little by little, until finally you can see what's on the other side. I started taking better care of myself both physically and mentally. I got back into working out, eating healthier, and making time for the things I enjoy. I rediscovered hobbies I had long forgotten, activities that had nothing to do with Sarah or our marriage. It helped me create a life that felt like my own again, not just a shadow of what we once had. But relationships, that's a different story. I'm not looking for anything. I've come to realize that some things in life just aren't for me, and relationships might be one of those things. I don't trust love anymore, at least not the way I used to. After everything I went through, it's hard to imagine letting someone get that close again, giving them that much power over me. People say you shouldn't let one bad experience define you, but this wasn't just a single bad experience, this was my entire world, and it crumbled. And honestly, I'm okay with that. I'm fine being on my own. Some people believe you need someone else to feel complete, that life is only meaningful when shared with another person. But I've learned you can be whole by yourself. You can find peace, happiness, and fulfillment without needing someone else by your side. I don't need a relationship to feel like my life has purpose. These days, my focus is on me, my work, my health, my future. I travel when I feel like it. I spend time with friends. I live my life free from drama or baggage weighing me down. It's simple, it's peaceful, and it's exactly what I need. Will I ever change my mind? Maybe. Who knows what the future holds? But for now, I'm done with love, done with relationships, done with risking my heart for someone else. I've learned that sometimes the only person you can truly rely on is yourself, and that's enough for me. So yeah, I'm doing well better than I have in years. And if that means staying single and focusing on myself, then so be it. I've earned this peace and I'm not about to give it up for anyone. Not anymore.